On the 14th morning, Diane Mercer stood in the Missouri heat and watched everything she had built begin to come apart. The excavator sat 30 feet away with its hydraulic arm hanging limp and useless, the way a broken wing hangs on a bird that will never fly again. 3 burst hoses coiled in the red clay beside the tracks, and a dark stain of hydraulic fluid spread slowly across the earth, like a wound that had given up trying to stop bleeding. The caterpillar, 350, had cost her $400,000. It weighed 40 tons. It could dig a swimming pool in a single day and move enough earth in a week to reshape a hillside, and for 14 days it had not moved the stump by a single inch. The stump sat where it had always sat, where it had sat for 300 years. The trunk of the old oak had measured 8 feet across at the base when they cut it down 6 weeks ago. The loggers had taken 2 full days to bring it down, specialized equipment, a professional crew, careful work. The tree itself had gone quietly enough turned into lumber that was probably sitting in a sawmill somewhere right now, waiting to become the kind of custom furniture that rich people put in houses they rarely used. But the stump remained. The root system spread 40 feet in every direction, thick as telephone poles near the center, branching and rebranching into thousands of smaller tendons that gripped the Missouri clay the way a drowning man grips a rope. This tree had been growing since before the American Revolution. Its roots had spent 3 centuries claiming this particular piece of ground as their own, becoming something that did not understand the concept of surrender, something that had weathered drought and flood and ice storms and the slow turning of seasons longer than anyone alive could remember. It was not going to move because Diane Mercer needed it gone. She understood that now in a way she had not understood 2 weeks ago when she had stood in this same spot and told her crew it would take an afternoon. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jeans. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. Dennis Crowell. She turned it face down and slid it back into her pocket without answering. Let me tell you about Diane Mercer because the situation she was standing in that July morning did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 20 years of decisions, some brilliant and some catastrophic, and the particular kind of pride that grows in a person who has clawed their way up from nothing and cannot quite allow themselves to believe the climb might end. She had started on her father's crew at age 19, swinging a framing hammer on residential projects in the smaller towns of central Missouri. Her father, Carl Mercer, was a builder of the old school, the kind of man who could read a set of blueprints the way other men read newspapers, who knew by the sound of a nail going in whether the stud behind the drywall was solid or rotted, who could look at a foundation and tell you inside 5 minutes whether the contractor who poured it had known what he was doing. Carl never went to college. He learned everything he knew from men who had learned it from men before them, a long chain of practical knowledge passed through calloused hands and patient instruction. Diane absorbed all of it. By the time she was 25, she was running crews that included men twice her age. By 30, she was the site foreman on projects that other contractors submitted bids for and lost. She had a gift that her father recognized and could not entirely explain, a way of seeing a problem, whole of understanding not just what needed to be done, but in what order, at what cost, by when, with what margin for error. She thought in systems the way some people think in words, everything connected to everything else, every decision downstream from the one before it. When she was 28, she married Dennis Crowell. Dennis was smart and charming and ambitious in a way that looked for the first several years like the same thing as drive. He had his own construction company, commercial work, mostly office buildings and retail centers, and the kind of institutional projects that came with steady government contracts and reliable payment schedules. Together, Mercer Crowell Construction became one of the larger residential and commercial builders in central Missouri. They were by any external measure a success story. The marriage lasted 14 years. The business partnership lasted 12. Diane would not talk about what ended the marriage, not then, and not later, not in any detail. What she would say when people asked was that she had confused shared ambition with shared values, and that by the time she understood the difference, it was too late to do anything except make the separation as clean as possible. The lawyers divided everything. Dennis took the commercial division, the established contracts, the client relationships that generated the steady income that made a business feel permanent. Diane took the residential division, some equipment, and a debt load that would have crushed a less determined person. She spent 2 years rebuilding. She took risks that scared her accountant and baffled her competitors. She bid on projects that other contractors passed over either because the margins were too thin, or the sites too difficult, or the timelines too aggressive. She financed equipment she could not quite afford, because she had learned, or thought she had learned, that the contractor with the most impressive machinery got the most impressive contracts. She drove a white Cadillac Eldorado convertible with Mercer Construction painted on the doors in gold lettering, and she brought clients to her job sites and showed them what modern equipment could do, and she spoke with the confidence of a person who had already won, even when the numbers on her balance sheet told a more complicated story. Have you ever put on a costume so completely that you forgot it was a costume? Have you ever decided, consciously or not, that the version of yourself the world needed to see was different enough from the version that went to sleep at night that you had to keep the two of them carefully separated? That is what Diane Mercer had done, and for 2 years it had worked well enough that she almost believed in it herself. Then came Deer Creek Estates. The project was her masterpiece, or it was supposed to be. 50 luxury homes on 5-acre lots in Callaway County starting at $500,000 each. A gated community with its own private lake tennis courts, a clubhouse designed by an architect from St. Louis. The kind of development that would establish Mercer Construction as something permanent, something that did not depend on any single contract or any single relationship to survive. The kind of project that would prove to the people in her industry who still sometimes looked at her with the particular skepticism reserved for women in fields that had been male for a very long time, that she did not need anyone's help to build something that mattered. She had borrowed $2.3 million to make it happen. The loan was secured against everything she owned. The terms were straightforward. Sell 15 homes from Phase 1 before October. 15 homes at $500,000 each meant $7.5 million in revenue, enough to retire the construction debt fund Phase 2 and establish the kind of financial cushion that would let her breathe for the first time in 2 years. The math was not complicated. The path was not complicated. All she had to do was execute. The entrance road was critical to everything. It curved gracefully through a stand of mature trees, creating exactly the impression Diane wanted when buyers drove in for the first time. Money, privacy, nature preserved but tamed the sense that someone with genuine taste had thought carefully about every detail. The design called for the road to pass within feet of where the old oak had stood. The tree itself had been removed on schedule, the stump had not. She had looked at that stump 6 weeks ago and seen a problem that would take an afternoon to solve. She had been catastrophically wrong. The Caterpillar 3.5. Oh, was Diane's pride, and she understood now her vanity made physical. She had bought it 8 months earlier for $400,000, financed over 7 years at terms that made her accountant leave a voicemail he described as urgent. 40 tons of yellow steel and hydraulic pressure, a machine that could do the work of 50 men, that could reshape the physical world in ways that previous generations could only have understood as a kind of miracle. The salesman had shown her videos of excavators pulling stumps in minutes, roots popping from the soil like weeds from a garden bed, the earth yielding to the will of the machine without argument or resistance. She had believed the videos. That was her first mistake. She had run the excavator herself for the initial attempt, wanting to demonstrate to her crew what modern equipment could accomplish in the hands of someone who understood power and leverage, wanting to feel the raw capability of $400,000 working in her hands. She had positioned the machine, extended the boom, wrapped the bucket around the base of the stump, and engaged the hydraulics with the confidence of someone who has never yet failed at the thing she is attempting. The stump did not move. She pushed harder. The hydraulic lines began to emit a high-pitched whine that any experienced operator would have recognized immediately as the sound of pressure building beyond rated capacity. She should have backed off. Any competent operator would have disengaged before something broke. Diane was not a competent operator. She was a builder who understood heavy equipment in theory, who had been around these machines for 20 years without ever quite mastering them, who believed in the way that people who have succeeded at many difficult things sometimes believe that determination could substitute for skill. The first hose blew at 3:47 in the afternoon. The sound cracked across the construction site like a rifle shot. Hydraulic fluid sprayed in a pressurized arc across the machine, across the stump, across the designer jeans that cost more than most of her crew made in a week. The excavator's arm dropped the bucket, striking the stump with a metallic clang that sounded to Diane like the particular sound of failure. She had fixed it. She had tried again. A second hose blew 30 minutes later. They fixed that one and brought in a bulldozer to push while the excavator pulled 30 tons of combined steel and hydraulic force working in tandem against a root system that was 3 centuries old and entirely unimpressed. A third hose blew just before sunset. That had been 12 days ago. Now Diane stood in the morning heat with $30,000 spent on repairs and delays, a deadline that was not moving, a loan officer who called every 2 days with questions she answered with careful lies, and a stump that had not shifted by a fraction of an inch. Boyd Rader walked up beside her. Boyd was 55 years old and had been working construction since before Diane was born. He had a weathered face that had absorbed decades of Missouri sun, and a way of standing that suggested he had seen enough difficult situations to know that panic never improved any of them. He had stayed loyal to Diane through the divorce and the rebuild and the harder stretches of the last 2 years, even when loyalty meant smaller paychecks than he could have gotten elsewhere. And she trusted him more than she trusted almost anyone. "We could blast it," he said. "Too close to the property line. The county will never permit it in a residential zone." Boyd nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Chemicals take 6 months minimum. We don't have 6 months. Buyers for the first phase close in October. If that entrance road isn't poured by September, we're in breach on every purchase agreement." Manual removal. Boyd said it the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to. I got a quote last week. 40 workers, 3 weeks, $250,000. And the company said they might not be able to move the center mass. Root system goes down at least 15 feet. Diane said nothing. The numbers sat between them in the morning air. $250,000 was money she did not have. Even if she had it, 3 weeks was time the schedule could not absorb without consequences that would cascade through every downstream commitment she had made. Boyd shifted his weight. Boss, there's something else. She looked at him. My son-in-law got laid off last month. Plant outside Fulton closed. He has 2 kids, mortgaged the whole thing. I told him this project would carry through October. Told him I'd have work for him starting phase 2 in November. Boyd did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Diane understood exactly what he was describing, the way a single project failure spreads outward like a stone dropped in water, the rings reaching people who had nothing to do with the original decision, who had only made the mistake of depending on someone who had made a promise. It won't fail, she said. She said it with a certainty she did not feel. Boyd looked at the stump. Then he looked at the excavator. Then he looked at Diane with the patient eyes of a man who had worked beside her long enough to know when she was performing and when she was not. He walked back toward the crew without another word. Diane pulled her phone from her pocket. Dennis Krall had called again. She had 3 voicemails from the loan officer at the bank whose name was a man named Garrett, and whose voice had been moving steadily over the past 2 weeks from professional courtesy toward something that sounded more like warning. She had a message from the St. Louis architect asking about a timeline for the clubhouse foundation, a message from a tile supplier asking about a payment that was 10 days past due, a message from her real estate agent who had 2 potential buyers asking about the entrance road and whether it would be finished before their scheduled walkthrough. She stood in the Missouri heat and did not answer any of them. What most people did not know, standing at the edges of Diane Mercer's life and watching what looked from the outside like a capable woman managing a complicated situation, was how close to the edge she actually was. The math of her position was not mysterious, but it was merciless. She needed to sell 15 homes. She needed the entrance road finished to sell the homes. She could not finish the entrance road until the stump was gone, and she was out of conventional options for removing the stump. That night, after the crew went home, Diane sat in her car in the driveway of her house in Fulton and did not get out. The lights were on in the kitchen. Through the window she could see the silhouette of her daughter Petra moving around the table, books spread across the surface, the architecture drafting tools that Diane had bought her for her birthday arranged in a neat line along the edge. Petra was 16 and had decided at age 12 that she wanted to design buildings, and she had been working toward that goal with a focus that reminded Diane so completely of herself at the same age that it sometimes stopped her breathing. Petra believed her mother was building something permanent. She believed that the project her mother had staked their security on was going to succeed because her mother had said it would, and because she had not yet lived long enough to accumulate sufficient evidence that determination alone could not guarantee outcomes. Diane sat in the car and looked at the kitchen window and thought about that. She took out her phone. She found the number for Dennis Krall and held her thumb over the call button for a long moment, maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer. He would answer. He would be gracious about it. That was his particular gift, the ability to be gracious at exactly the moment when graciousness felt most like a knife. He would tell her his crew could handle the stump removal. He would tell her not to worry about the cost. He would handle it quietly. He would say, as if the favor were purely personal, as if it had nothing to do with the leverage it would give him, the story it would let him tell for the next 20 years, about the time he bailed out his ex-wife's company because she bought equipment she didn't know how to operate and backed herself into a corner she couldn't get out of alone. Diane turned her phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the kitchen window for another minute. Then she got out of the car and went inside. The next morning she was back on the site at 6:30. The crew arrived at 7. The stump sat where it always sat, patient and immovable in the morning light, roots gripping the red clay with a permanence that made Diane feel standing 20 feet away with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand that she was in an argument with time itself. It was Boyd who heard it first. He turned toward the access road that connected the construction site to the county highway and tilted his head slightly the way a man tilts his head when he hears something he cannot yet identify but recognizes on some level deeper than conscious thought. Then Diane heard it too, metallic, rhythmic, a slow and deliberate clanking that came from somewhere beyond the rise at the edge of the property, getting louder with each second. The Caterpillar 20 crawler crested the rise the way old things move when they have nowhere in particular to be and nothing left to prove. It was small by any modern standard, maybe 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, painted a rust orange that had faded over 6 decades to the color of old pennies left too long in a drawer. Its tracks were steel, not rubber, and they pressed into the dry Missouri ground with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its size, each rotation sending a faint tremor through the earth that you could feel in your boots if you were standing close enough. The engine ran on gasoline and breathed with the loose, unhurried rhythm of something that has been running for a very long time and intends to keep running for a very long time more. The man sitting in the operator seat was 71 years old. He wore faded denim overalls and a flannel shirt despite the July heat, and a work cap with a broken brim that had been bent back from years of use. His hands on the controls were thick with the kind of calluses that come from decades of gripping things, not just tools, but the physical world itself, the levers and chains and steering wheels of a life spent solving problems with his hands. His face was deeply lined, the lines going not in the directions that worry and stress make lines, but in the directions that sun and wind and outdoor labor make them, which is a different thing entirely. Behind the crawler he towed a flatbed trailer. On the trailer were chains and pulleys and wooden blocks and lengths of heavy cable, all of it arranged with the care of someone who has used these things so many times that they know exactly where everything should go. The equipment looked to Diane like something from a different century, which was accurate. The crawler stopped at the edge of the work area. The man climbed down from the operator's seat with the deliberate care of someone who has learned not to move faster than his body is prepared to move each step considered nothing wasted. He walked toward Diane with a gait that she would think about later, trying to find the right word for it, and the word she would eventually land on was settled. He walked like a man who was entirely settled in his own skin, who had nothing to demonstrate to anyone, and was therefore completely free to simply be wherever he was. "Morning," he said. Diane crossed her arms. She could feel her crew watching. "This is a closed construction site. We have insurance liability rules about visitors." The man looked at her with pale gray eyes that did not seem particularly impressed by this information. I'm not a visitor, he said. I'm your neighbor. He nodded toward the farm that bordered the construction site to the north. Harlan Greer. I've been farming that land for 40 years. His eyes moved to the stump, to the excavator with its damaged hydraulic system. Back to the stump. Saw you've been having some trouble with that oak, he said. We have it handled. Harlan Greer looked at the broken excavator, at the stump, at the $30,000 of failure spread across the red clay of the construction site. His expression did not change. It showed neither judgment nor amusement, only a kind of patient assessment, the look of a man reading a situation the way other men read maps. Looks like it, he said. The laughter started in Diane's chest before she could stop it. Not the warm laughter of someone who finds something genuinely funny, but the harder, sharper laughter of someone who is running on 2 weeks of stress and sleepless nights and has just been handed an easy target. Is there something you needed, Mr. Greer? Thought I might be able to help. He said it simply without elaboration, the way someone states a fact that does not require decoration. You thought you might help. Diane pointed at the crawler sitting 20 yards away, at the rust-orange machine that looked like a museum exhibit about the Depression era. That machine, she said, weighing maybe 2 tons. About that. My excavator weighs 40 tons. My bulldozer weighs 30. Together they could not move that stump a single inch. She shook her head, the laughter in her voice now carrying something harder than humor. And you think that antique is going to do what $400,000 of modern equipment couldn't manage? The crew had stopped working. Some of them were leaning on tools. Others had moved closer to here. Diane could feel their attention the way you feel heat from a fire. Harlan Greer did not respond to the laughter. He did not rise to it, did not show any reaction to it, except perhaps a slight stilling. The way a man goes still when he is listening to something that does not require a response. He was looking at the stump. Your machines are strong, he said finally, but strength isn't what this problem needs. He turned to look at her, and his voice was even and unhurried. You've been trying to pull that stump out all at once. Hydraulics push and pull in straight lines. They're designed for lifting, for digging, for moving loose material. But a stump like this isn't held by one force. It's held by thousands of roots, each one anchored in a different direction, each one pulling back from a different angle. You can't beat all of those forces simultaneously. You have to beat them one at a time. Diane stared at him. How do you propose to do that? Mechanical advantage, he said. Patience. He gestured toward the trailer, toward the chains and pulleys and wooden blocks that looked like they belonged in a history textbook. I have a block and tackle system that multiplies force by a factor of 6. My crawler makes about 25 horsepower at the drawbar. With the pulleys, that becomes effectively 150 horsepower applied slowly and steadily from the right angle. That still isn't as much as my excavator produces. No. But it's applied differently. Your excavator makes its power in bursts. Hydraulic pressure builds, reaches its limit, and either something moves or something breaks. My system doesn't have a limit. It just keeps pulling, keeps applying force until the roots give up one at a time. There was a silence after he said this that had a different quality than the silence before it. Diane heard what he said. She heard it clearly, and it landed somewhere in the back of her mind, where things land when they are true and inconvenient at the same time. This is ridiculous, she said. But the words came out quieter than she had intended and without the certainty she had been carrying all morning. Maybe Harlan said, but you've been working on this for 2 weeks, and that stump hasn't moved. He looked at her with the pale gray eyes. What do you have to lose by letting me try? Diane looked at the stump. She looked at the excavator. She looked at Boyd Rader, who was watching her from 15 feet away with an expression that was entirely neutral, which from Boyd meant something specific. She thought about Petra at the kitchen table with her drafting tools arranged in a careful line. She thought about the loan officer named Garrett, whose voice had been shifting in a direction she did not like. She thought about Dennis Krall's number sitting in her phone patient as the stump itself waiting for her to make the call that would end this particular problem and create a different, larger one. Fine, she said. The word came out like a door closing on something she had been holding open. Show me what it can do. But when it breaks down, try and you haul it off my site yourself. Harlan nodded once. Fair enough. He walked back toward the crawler with the same settled walk, unhurried and unburdened, and climbed back into the operator seat with the same deliberate care. Boyd materialized at Diane's shoulder. Let him try, Boyd said quietly. We got nothing to lose. I know. She said it with an edge, then softened it. I know. She walked back to her Cadillac and got in and closed the door against the heat. Through the windshield, she watched Harlan Greer climb down from the crawler and walk to the stump, and she watched him do something that she had not expected, something that stopped her from reaching for her phone or her coffee or any of the distractions she had been using for 2 weeks to avoid sitting with the full weight of how bad things had gotten. He stopped in front of the stump and knelt down in the Missouri clay, both knees on the ground, and pressed both palms flat against the earth at the base of the roots. He held them there without moving. He was not doing anything that Diane could identify as productive. He was not measuring or marking or attaching equipment. He was simply kneeling in the dirt with his hands pressed to the ground, and he was staying there, and the staying was deliberate. Not the absence of action, but a kind of action in itself. Boyd had followed Diane to the car and was standing a few feet away. From across the construction site, they could both see the old farmer kneeling in the dirt with his hands flat on the earth. What is he doing? Diane asked. Reading it, Boyd said. Diane looked at Boyd. Reading it, Boyd said again. The roots, the depth, the direction they run. He's finding out what he's dealing with before he tries to deal with it. Diane looked back at Harlan kneeling in the dirt. She thought about the 2 weeks she had spent attacking the stump with the largest equipment she had never once, doing what Harlan Greer was doing right now, never once stopping to understand the problem before trying to overpower it. She opened her notebook, the leather-bound planner she kept for project timelines and cost tracking. She wrote, "Read it before you pull it." Then she sat back and watched the old farmer, who was still kneeling in the Missouri clay with his palms pressed flat against the roots of a 300-year-old oak tree, reading something in the earth that Diane Mercer, with all her equipment and all her ambition and all her 2 decades of building things, had never learned how to read. The morning sun climbed toward its apex. The cicadas screamed in the trees along the property line, and on a construction site in Callaway County, Missouri, a woman who had spent her whole professional life believing that the right equipment and enough determination could solve any problem sat in the air conditioning of a car she could not afford, and watched an old man with his hands in the dirt begin to teach her something she was going to need for the rest of her life. Harlan Greer spent the better part of an hour doing nothing that looked like work. He walked around the stump in slow circles, stopping every few feet to crouch down and press his fingers into the exposed roots near the surface, testing their diameter, following their direction with his palm, the way a blind man reads a page. Sometimes he would push a thin steel rod into the clay at different distances from the base, driving it down 6 inches, then pulling it free and moving to another spot, reading whatever information came back through the metal and into his hand. He worked without speaking, without acknowledging the crew watching from the perimeter, without any apparent awareness that he was being observed at all. The construction workers had stopped pretending to do other things. They stood in a loose, informal arc around the work area, arms crossed or hands in pockets, watching the old farmer, the way people watch something they cannot yet classify. Some of them had been on Diane's crew for years. Most of them had spent their working lives around heavy equipment, around the particular logic of modern construction, which said that the right machine applied with sufficient force could move anything that needed moving. What Harlan Greer was doing did not belong to that logic, and they watched it the way people watch something that does not fit into any category they already possess. Diane watched from the Cadillac. She had told herself she was reviewing contract documents on her phone. She had opened 3 of them and read none of them. Her eyes kept returning to the old farmer moving slowly around the base of the stump, his flannel shirt dark with sweat across the shoulders, his worn boots leaving deliberate impressions in the red Missouri clay. She opened her notebook instead. She did not make a conscious decision to start sketching the pulley system. Her hand simply began moving across the page the way hands sometimes move when the mind is working on something it has not yet brought to the surface. She drew what she could see from the trailer 6 pulleys of varying size chains of different weights, the wooden blocks that would serve as anchor points in the ground. She drew lines showing what she understood of the force multiplication, the way each additional pulley in the series reduced the input force required to move a given load. She had learned the physics of this in a construction engineering course she had taken at the University of Missouri when she was 23. She remembered the equations in the way you remember things learned long ago that you have never needed to use abstractly correctly in theory, but disconnected from any practical application. Mechanical advantage. The ratio of output force to input force. The principle that a simple machine could allow a smaller force to move a larger resistance, provided you were willing to trade force for distance, provided you understood that there was no free energy in the universe, only different ways of applying the energy you had. She ran the numbers in the margin of the notebook. Harlan's crawler approximately 25 horsepower at the drawbar. Through a 6-pulley block and tackle system, effectively 150 horsepower of pulling force, applied steadily from a precisely calculated angle against a single root at a time rather than against the entire mass simultaneously. Her excavator more than 300 horsepower, applied in hydraulic bursts in a single direction against the entire root system at once. She stared at what she had written. The math was not complicated, the physics was not mysterious, the reason her $400,000 machine had failed, and the reason a 62-year-old crawler might succeed, was not about the relative quality of the machines. It was about the difference between force applied wrongly and force applied correctly, between power that overwhelmed a system and patience that dismantled it. She wrote in the margin, "Strength is not the same as application." Then she sat back and thought about all the ways that sentence was true that had nothing to do with stump removal. Boyd Rader knocked on the passenger window. She rolled it down. "He's ready to start," Boyd said. Diane got out of the car. Harlan had completed his examination and was unloading equipment from the trailer with the methodical efficiency of a man who has performed this sequence of actions enough times that it no longer requires conscious thought. He drove steel stakes into the ground at measured distances from the stump, 4 of them positioned at different angles, each one oriented toward a different section of the root system. He ran chains from these anchor points to the stump, threading each one through its corresponding pulley, with care checking the seating of every link before moving to the next. When he finished the arrangement, the stump sat at the center of a web of chains and cables, each line running to a different anchor point, each angle calculated to apply force against a specific portion of the roots rather than against the whole. A younger worker on the crew, a man named Cody, who had been with Mercer Construction for about 8 months and who was the kind of person who asked questions that other people had already given up asking, walked over to where Harlan was connecting the final chain to the crawler. "What is all this?" Cody asked. Harlan did not look up from the connection he was checking. "The north side roots are shallower than the south," he said. "Shallower means less anchored. I'm going to pull the north side first. Pop those roots out of the ground one at a time. Then I'll shift to the east side, then the west. The south side will come last, and by then the stump won't have anything left to hold on to." Cody looked at the arrangement of chains and pulleys, trying to work out the geometry of it. "How long will that take?" Harlan straightened up and looked at the sky, then at the stump with the expression of a man doing a calculation that involves too many variables for precision, but whose experience has given him something better than precision. "If nothing breaks," he said, "maybe 4 hours." Cody laughed. The sound carried across the construction site. "Ms. Mercer's been at this for 2 weeks." Harlan looked at him without any particular expression. "Ms. Mercer's been fighting the whole stump at once," he said. "I'm going to take it apart piece by piece." He climbed back onto the Caterpillar 20 and engaged the clutch. "Now let me tell you what happened next, because it happened slowly, and slowly is the only way it could have happened, and the slowness is part of what made it matter." The crawler moved forward by small increments, taking up the slack in the first chain, the one that ran to the anchor stake positioned on the north side. The chain went taut. The pulleys took the load. The engine changed pitch as resistance built against the crawler's forward motion, the sound dropping and thickening the way an engine sounds when it is doing real work. For a long moment nothing visible happened. The chain was tight as a guitar string. The pulleys were under load. The crawler's tracks had pressed themselves into the Missouri clay and were holding there, fighting the resistance with everything the old machine had. But the stump did not move, and the roots did not move, and for 20 or 30 seconds, the entire system was simply a demonstration of opposing forces in perfect static balance. Diane watched from 20 feet away. She had her notebook open but was not writing in it. She was watching the ground on the north side of the stump, the packed clay between the anchor stake and the root system, because some instinct she could not have named told her that was where something would happen first. She saw it before she heard it. A hairline fracture appeared in the clay, approximately 3 feet from the stump's base, running perpendicular to the direction of the chain's pull. It was barely visible, the kind of thing you would miss entirely if you were not watching for it, a fine dark line in the red earth that had not been there the moment before. Then the line widened. Then the sound came, a single sharp crack, deep and clean, like a large knuckle releasing after a long time under pressure. The clay on the north side shifted by perhaps 2 inches. The chain went momentarily slack as the resistance it had been pulling against suddenly decreased, then tightened again as the crawler continued forward. The first root buried 3 feet down and running north from the base of the stump, had broken free from the earth. The construction site went absolutely silent. Not the comfortable silence of people quietly working, but the arrested silence of people who have witnessed something unexpected and are still processing whether it was real. Cody, standing at the edge of the work area, had stopped laughing. The men who had been leaning on their tools were standing upright now, their full attention on the stump and the old crawler and the chain that had just accomplished in 10 minutes what 40 tons of modern equipment had not managed in 2 weeks. Diane Mercer walked out of the Cadillac's shadow and did not realize she had done it until she was already standing in the morning sun. Harlan did not celebrate. He did not look around to see who had noticed. He disengaged the clutch, climbed down from the operator's seat with the same deliberate care he brought to every movement, walked to the chain arrangement and repositioned the first chain to the next attachment point, slightly east of where it had been aimed at the second root, in the sequence he had mapped during his examination. Then he climbed back up and began again. Boyd Rader appeared at Diane's elbow. "Is it working?" she asked. The words came out quietly, almost tentative, in a register that Boyd had not heard from her in the 2 years he had worked for Mercer Construction. Not the voice she used with clients or contractors or loan officers, or the ex-husband who called at inconvenient times. Something under all of that. "Yes, ma'am," Boyd said. "It is." They stood together and watched Harlan Greer break the second root. This one took 12 minutes. The crack in the clay came in the same way, the hairline fracture appearing first, then the widening, then the deep, clean sound of something that had been held for a very long time finally releasing. The stump did not move visibly, but something in the set of it changed some quality of its relationship to the ground it sat in, as if it had shifted from absolute certainty to something fractionally less than that. "How is this possible?" Diane said. "My excavator makes 10 times the horsepower." Boyd was quiet for a moment, watching Harlan reposition the chain for the third pull. "He's not using horsepower," Boyd said finally. "He's using leverage. That's the same thing." Boyd shook his head slowly. "No, it isn't. Your excavator applies force in one direction all at once, like trying to open a locked door by pushing on it harder and harder until either the lock breaks or the door frame breaks or your hydraulic hoses break." Boyd nodded toward the web of chains and pulleys. "George is working the hinges, taking the door apart piece by piece so that by the time he gets to the lock there's nothing left for the lock to hold." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Working the hinges." The third root broke at 11:47 in the morning. The fourth followed 20 minutes after that. Harlan moved around the stump's perimeter with the same unhurried efficiency, repositioning his equipment with precision, checking every connection before applying load, never rushing and never pausing longer than the work required. By the time he had finished the north side 6 roots broken over the course of 90 minutes, the stump had shifted visibly. Not much. Perhaps an inch of tilt toward the south, which was the side with the deepest roots, and therefore the side that would come last. But it was movement. After 2 weeks of absolute impervious stillness, the 300-year-old oak was beginning to surrender. Diane had moved away from the Cadillac entirely by now. She stood at the edge of the work area with her notebook, sketching angles and writing observations, trying to capture not just the mechanical process but the thinking behind it. The particular intelligence that had looked at a problem everyone else was trying to solve with force, and had understood that force was not what the problem required, She was so absorbed in this that she almost missed Boyd walking over to stand beside her again, and almost missed the quality of his voice when he spoke. "Boss," he said, and there was something different in the way he said it. Not the steady, neutral Boyd Raider of the construction site, but something older, something that had been sitting with him for a while before he decided to say it out loud. Diane looked up from her notebook. "My father had a John Deere," Boyd said. "Old Model B from the late 40s. He ran it until I was in my 20s. When I was about 16, I told him it was junk. Told him we should sell it for scrap and get something newer. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, 'Son, this machine is older than you, and it will still be working long after you are gone.'" Boyd paused. His eyes were on the crawler on Harlan repositioning the chain for the east side of the stump. "I thought he was just being cheap," Boyd said. "Thought he was making a virtue out of not being able to afford new equipment. I didn't understand what he was actually saying until much later." "What was he actually saying?" Diane asked. "That the value of a tool isn't in what year it was made, it's in whether it was built for the right purpose and maintained by someone who understood it." Boyd looked at his hands for a moment. "That John Deere is still running on my brother's farm. My father has been gone for 11 years. Diane looked back at the stump at the inch of tilt that had not been there 2 hours ago. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. A text message from Dennis Krall. She read it. "Heard about your situation. Offer still stands. Just say the word." She held the phone for a moment, looked at Harlan Greer, who was wrapping the chain around a root on the east side of the stump with the same methodical care he had brought to every previous step. Looked at the excavator sitting useless 30 feet away, the machine she had mortgaged her future to own and had not known how to operate well enough to protect its own hydraulic lines. She put the phone back in her pocket without responding. It was the first time in 2 years that she had ignored a message from Dennis Krall without spending the next 30 minutes rehearsing what she would say to him when he followed up. She did not know why it was different this time. She would not understand until later when she had more distance from the day and could see it more clearly that it was different because she was watching someone solve a problem with knowledge she had not known she was missing, and the watching was doing something to the part of her that had been pretending for 2 years that she had everything she needed. The east side took longer than the north. The roots ran deeper on this side, some of them going down 6 feet or more before they began to spread laterally through the clay. Harlan broke 7 roots over the course of nearly 2 hours each pull, requiring more time than the last, as the resistance increased with depth. The stump tilted another 2 inches. The crater around its base was widening as the clay pulled and shifted with each freed root, the earth around the stump beginning to look less like solid ground and more like something in the process of releasing what it had held. It was during the east side work between the 4th and 5th root of that sequence that the thing happened that Diane would think about most in the months and years afterward. Not the climax, not the dramatic conclusion that was still an hour away, but this smaller, quieter moment that she almost missed. Harlan stopped the crawler in the middle of a pull. He had been applying steady pressure for about 6 minutes. The chain tight, the pulleys under load, the crawler's tracks pressed into the clay and holding, and then without any visible reason, without anything breaking or failing, he simply stopped, disengaged the clutch, let the tension go out of the chain, climbed down from the operator's seat. He walked to the pulley arrangement and began examining it link by link, moving his hands along the chain with slow attention. Diane watched him. The crew watched him. Nobody spoke. He found it in the third pulley from the anchor stake. A crack in one of the chain links, barely visible, the kind of stress fracture that forms when metal has been under repeated high load, and the crystalline structure of the steel begins to fail from the inside out. You would not see it from a distance. You would not feel it unless you were moving your hands along the chain with the specific intention of finding it. But it was there, and if the chain had continued under load, it would have failed, and when a chain under that kind of tension fails, the stored energy releases in a direction you cannot predict, and people can be hurt. Harlan carried the damaged link to his trailer and returned with a replacement section from a coil of spare chain that had been sitting on the flatbed since he arrived. He fitted the replacement with unhurried competence, checked the connections on either side of it, and walked back to the crawler. Diane realized she had been holding her breath. She looked at her excavator. She thought about whether she had ever in 2 weeks of attempting to remove this stump walked around her equipment and checked each connection and each fitting and each hydraulic line with her hands feeling for damage before it became failure. She thought about whether she had ever in her professional life treated preparation as a form of action rather than as a delay before action. She wrote in her notebook, "He brought spare chain. He knew something might fail before it failed." Then underneath, "I never planned for failure. I planned for success and left no room for anything else." Harlan climbed back onto the crawler and continued. The west side took another hour and 40 minutes. 14 more roots, the clay on this side harder and drier than the east, which meant the roots had grown differently, spreading more laterally and less deeply, creating a different kind of resistance that Harlan adjusted for by changing his anchor point angles and reducing the speed of his pulls. He made these adjustments without explaining them to anyone, without consulting anything external, drawing entirely on the knowledge that had been built into him over decades of doing this work on this kind of soil in this particular corner of Missouri. Cody had stopped moving entirely. He was sitting on an overturned bucket at the edge of the work area, elbows on his knees, watching Harlan work with an expression that had moved a long way from the laughter of that morning. 2 of the other crew members had pulled out their phones and were filming. Not for any purpose they could have articulated, but because something was happening that their instinct told them they might want to remember. Boyd stood beside Diane and said nothing. He had said what he needed to say. Now he was simply watching, and his watching had the quality of a man who is seeing something confirmed that he had long suspected but had not been in a position to demonstrate. The stump now tilted at roughly 20 degrees toward the south. It sat in a crater of disturbed earth, the clay around its base broken and churned from the work of the morning, the exposed roots on 3 sides either severed or pulled free from the ground. What remained was the south side, the oldest roots, the ones that had been in the ground the longest and had gone the deepest and had had the most time to make themselves permanent. Harlan climbed down from the crawler for the last time before the final pull. He walked to the stump and crouched beside the south-facing base, pressing his hand against the clay, the same way he had at the beginning, reading whatever the earth was still telling him. He stayed like that for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he stood and walked to his trailer and pulled out the largest chain Diane had yet seen, links the size of a grown man's fist forged from steel that looked older than anything else on the site. "This is the main pull," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Deep roots are all that's left. One steady pull should do it." He wrapped the chain around the center mass of the stump, not around an individual root, but around the stump itself, the connection point that everything else ran through. He ran it through the final pulley arrangement and connected it to the crawler with the same methodical care he had given to every previous step. The crew moved back instinctively. Nobody asked them to. They simply felt the moment and responded to it the way people respond to things that are about to matter. Diane did not move back. She stood at the edge of the crater and watched. She was aware in a way that she had not been aware of anything in a long time of the specific details of the moment, the smell of turned earth and machine oil and the particular green smell that cut clay releases when it is exposed to air, the sound of the cicadas in the trees along the property line, the way the morning light had shifted to afternoon light and was coming in now at a lower angle that made the disturbed earth around the stump look almost golden, the weight of the notebook in her left hand and the pen still in her right. She was aware of how much she had not been paying attention for how long. Harlan engaged the clutch and moved the crawler forward by small degrees, taking up the slack in the massive chain, letting the pulleys load gradually rather than snapping the system under sudden stress. The chain rose from the clay, shedding dirt as it tightened, and the pulleys creaked under a load that was different in magnitude from anything they had carried that day. The crawler's engine deepened to a register Diane had not heard from it before, the sound of an old machine being asked for everything it had. The steel tracks pressed themselves into the Missouri clay and held. The chain went rigid. The pulleys held their load. For a long moment nothing happened, and then the ground spoke. Not a crack this time, not the clean, sharp sound of a single root releasing. Something deeper and less precise, a sound that seemed to come from several feet underground, a groaning and a grinding and a tearing. That was the sound of 3 centuries of connection between a tree and its earth finally irrevocably ending. The stump moved. Not quickly. Not the way things move in movies with sudden drama and visual spectacle. It moved the way the earth itself moves, slowly and with enormous weight. The way things move when their movement is the result of forces that have been building for a very long time and have finally overcome the last resistance standing between them and release. The south side roots came up last, and all at once the final anchor points failing in a rapid sequence as each one transferred its load to the next and the next until there was nothing left to transfer to. The stump rose from the ground, trailing 40 feet of root system, dirt and rocks and broken clay cascading back into the crater, 15 feet of depth, coming up at once with a sound that Diane would later describe to people when she tried to describe it as the sound the earth makes when it finally lets something go. The stump cleared the hole. It rolled onto its side in the disturbed clay. The construction site was absolutely silent for 5 seconds. Diane counted them without meaning to. Then someone started clapping, and the sound of it broke something open in the air, and within moments the crew was cheering, and men who had been skeptical since early morning were slapping each other on the shoulders and pointing at the stump and at the crater and at the old rust-orange crawler that sat in the afternoon light with its engine idling as if it had done nothing more remarkable than move a piece of furniture from one room to another. Cody was not laughing. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the hole in the ground with an expression that belonged to someone who has just watched their understanding of something fundamental change in real time and has not yet caught up with the change. Boyd Rader stood beside Diane and was quiet. Diane did not cheer. She did not move. She stood at the edge of the crater and looked down into the earth where the roots had been, into the dark Missouri clay that had held a 300-year-old tree for 3 centuries, and had finally this afternoon been persuaded to let it go by an old man with a machine from 1932, and the patience to understand what he was dealing with before he tried to deal with it. The hole was perhaps 4 feet across at the top, and narrowed as it went down the walls, showing the clean cuts where the roots had been, the packed clay dark and damp at the deeper levels, the smell of it reaching her where she stood, that particular smell of old undisturbed earth being exposed to air for the first time in a very long time. She thought about what Boyd had said about the door and the hinges. She thought about the notebook in her hand and everything she had written in it that morning, the numbers and the angles and the small sentences that had been arriving in her like something returning after a long absence. She thought about Dennis Krall's text sitting unanswered in her phone, and for the first time in 2 years thinking about Dennis Krall did not produce in her the complicated mixture of anger and defensiveness and wounded pride that it usually produced. What it produced instead was something quieter and more useful, a kind of clarity about the distance between what she had been trying to do and what she had actually been doing. She had been trying to build something permanent. She had been doing it with the wrong tools applied in the wrong direction, and she had been too proud to stop and read the problem the way it needed to be read before she tried to solve it. Harlan Greer was coiling his chains on the trailer bed with the same unhurried efficiency he had brought to everything else. The Caterpillar 20 sat with its engine idling, patient and undemonstrative, exactly what it had always been. Diane watched him and understood with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes in the aftermath of things that have cost something real, that what she had watched today was not just the removal of a stump. It was an education in the difference between force and understanding, between the confidence of someone who has the largest machine in the room and the confidence of someone who knows exactly what the room requires. She closed her notebook. She walked toward the trailer. Harlan Greer did not look up when Diane walked toward him. He was coiling the last of the heavy chain onto the trailer bed, his hands moving through the familiar sequence of loop, and lay with the automatic competence of someone who has performed this action so many times that it no longer requires conscious direction. The Caterpillar 20 sat behind him with its engine idling down from the work, the old motor settling back into its resting rhythm, the way a working animal settles after a hard pull, something satisfied and unhurried in the sound of it. The crew was still talking behind her. She could hear Boyd organizing them back to their tasks, his steady voice cutting through the noise of celebration with the practical authority of a man who understood that work remaining was still work remaining regardless of what had just happened. Some of them were still looking at the stump, at the crater, at the crawler, trying to reconcile what they had watched with what they had believed this morning when the old farmer had come clattering up the access road in his rust-orange machine that looked like something a museum had misplaced. Diane stopped a few feet from the trailer. Harlan finished coiling the chain and straightened slowly, his hands going to his lower back for just a moment in the way of a man who has spent decades bending and lifting and has made a permanent arrangement with the discomfort that comes from it. He turned and looked at her with the same pale gray eyes that had not changed expression all day, that had shown neither satisfaction at the result nor memory of the morning's humiliation. "I owe you," Diane said. "Name your price." She meant it the way she meant everything when she was being her most direct, straightforwardly, and without performance, the way she talked when she was too tired to talk any other way. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly, not as a negotiating position, but as a simple statement of fact. "I didn't do this for payment," he said. "Everything you brought, the time, the equipment, the work. Name a figure." Harlan pulled a folded cloth from the front pocket of his overalls and wiped his hands with it, a gesture so habitual it seemed to happen outside his awareness. He looked at the construction site, at the cleared land that stretched behind Diane toward the stands of mature trees that would frame the entrance road, at the place where the old oak had stood for 3 centuries before anyone had decided that luxury homes needed to go there. "There is something I would want," he said, "but it isn't money." Diane waited. "A sign at the entrance," he said. "Something that tells people what this land was before it was this. Before the road and the houses and the fences. The Caldwell family farmed this ground for 150 years. Raised crops here, raised children here, built things that didn't last as long as they deserved to last. Nobody who buys one of these houses is going to know that unless someone tells them." He looked back at Diane. "Put up a sign that tells them." Diane studied him. "That's all." Harlan was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding whether to say the thing they have been thinking or to leave it unsaid. Then he said it. "My father bought this crawler in 1932. Paid $800 for it, which was the most money he had ever spent on any single thing in his life. He bought it because he had spent 3 days trying to pull a stump with 6 men and ropes and a team of mules, and the stump had not moved. He sat down after those 3 days and thought about why the stump had not moved, and then he thought about what it would take to actually move it. And he built the pulley system out of parts he bought from a farm equipment dealer in Colombia. It took him 2 weeks to figure out the right arrangement. Then he pulled the stump in 4 hours." Diane listened without speaking. "After that," Harlan said, "people knew what he could do. They would call him when they had stumps that nobody else could move. He would come with the crawler and the pulleys, and he would pull the stump, and he would not charge for it if the people could not afford to pay. He said the same thing to every person who asked him why he helped without charging. He said the quality of their manners does not change the quality of their need. If you can help and someone needs help, you help. That is the whole rule." He looked at Diane steadily. "One of those people called him junk in front of his hired hands," he said, "before my father had even gotten off the crawler. Called the machine a relic, and said the man driving it should go back where he came from. My father pulled the stump anyway. Did it the same as always. Refused the money the same as always." Diane felt the weight of this land on her. "I said something like that to you this morning," she said. "You did. I said it in front of my entire crew." "You did," Harlan said again, without inflection, without accusation, simply confirming a fact that they both already knew. "And you helped me anyway. My father taught me that the measure of a man is not how he is treated. It is what he does when he is treated poorly. He could have gone home after what that farmer said to him. Nobody would have faulted him. But he would have known what he had done, and that was what mattered to him." He looked at the crawler for a moment with something that was not quite sentiment, but was in the territory of it. "I try to be the man he was. Some days I am closer to it than others." Diane stood in the afternoon light and felt something shift in her chest that she could not have named, precisely something that had been held at a particular angle for a long time and was now slowly beginning to find a different position. "Put up the sign," Harlan said. "Make it something that lasts. Something that people will still be reading 20 years from now when none of us are around to explain it." He picked up the last coil of cable from the ground and set it on the trailer. "That is all I want." He climbed onto the Caterpillar 20 with the deliberate care that was characteristic of everything he did, each movement considered and unhurried. He engaged the clutch. The crawler turned slowly on its steel tracks. the engine settling into its traveling rhythm, and Harlan Greer drove back across the construction site toward the access road, without looking back, the empty flatbed trailer rattling behind him on the packed clay. Diane watched until the crawler disappeared over the rise, until the sound of the engine faded below the noise of the cicadas and the distant traffic on the county road. Boyd appeared at her elbow. She did not speak for a moment. Neither did he. Then Boyd said quietly, "He's something, isn't he?" "Yes," Diane said. "He is." She stood there a moment longer, looking at the hole in the ground where the stump had been, at the overturned root mass lying on its side in the disturbed clay, at the afternoon light slanting across the construction site and catching the upturned earth in a way that made it look almost like something being offered rather than something being excavated. Then she took out her phone and called the bank. Garrett answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular professional wariness of a man who has been trying to reach someone for 2 weeks and has developed a theory about why he cannot. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "The entrance road obstruction has been removed," Diane said. "We will pour the foundation Monday morning. The project is back on schedule." A pause. "How did you resolve it?" "I got help from someone who knew what he was doing," Diane said. Another pause, this one longer, the sound of a man recalibrating. "That is excellent news. We will need to see documented progress before we discuss the payment timeline." "I understand," Diane said. "The payment will be on time." She ended the call before Garrett could find another question to ask. She stood in the afternoon heat and thought about the first call she had made to Garrett 2 weeks ago, when she had told him smoothly and automatically that the situation was under control, that the obstruction would be cleared by the following Monday, that there was nothing to be concerned about. She had believed herself when she said it, or she had believed the version of herself that said things like that, the version that drove the white Cadillac and wore designer clothes to construction sites and never admitted even to herself when she was out of answers. That version of her had cost her $30,000 and 2 weeks and a great deal of the energy that fear requires when it is being managed instead of acknowledged. She opened her notebook to a clean page and began writing. She wrote for 40 minutes, standing beside the crater in the afternoon light, while the crew worked around her and Boyd kept the site moving with the quiet competence that had made him indispensable to her for 2 years. She wrote about what she had watched Harlan do and why it had worked. She wrote about the pulleys and the anchor points and the sequential approach to the root system. She wrote about what Boyd had said about the door and the hinges. She wrote about the spare chain on the trailer, about the deliberate inspection that had found the cracked link before it became a catastrophe, about the difference between a person who plans for success and a person who plans for the real world, which contains both success and failure in proportions that cannot be predicted in advance. And then she wrote something else, the thing that had been forming in her since she had stood at the edge of the crater and watched the roots come up, the thing that was not about mechanical advantage or pulley systems or any of the technical content of the afternoon. She wrote, "I have been trying to beat Dennis at his own game for 2 years. Bigger equipment, more impressive projects, more force. But that is not how you build something that lasts. You build something that lasts by understanding what you are actually building and why, and by being honest about what you know and what you do not know, and by being willing to ask for help before you have exhausted every other option and borrowed yourself into a corner." She read what she had written. Then she wrote one more line. The stump was never the problem. The stump was just the place where the actual problem became impossible to ignore. She closed the notebook. The next morning she made 2 phone calls she had been avoiding. The first was to a lawyer she trusted, a woman named Patricia Ogden, who had handled the divorce proceedings and who had been telling Diane for 18 months that she needed to restructure the loan arrangement on Deer Creek Estates before the terms became unmanageable. Diane had been avoiding this call because taking it would require her to admit in specific financial terms exactly how close to the edge she was, and she had been operating under the assumption that momentum and success would make the restructuring unnecessary before the question became urgent. It had become urgent. Patricia asked careful questions, and Diane answered them honestly without the careful editing that had characterized her conversations with the bank and with most of her professional contacts for the past 2 years. She said the numbers plainly. She described the situation plainly. Patricia listened without interrupting, and at the end said that the situation was manageable, but that they needed to move quickly and that she would have documents ready within a week. The second call was to a man named Warren Stiles, who was 68 years old and had been one of the best restoration contractors in central Missouri until he had retired 3 years ago when his wife's health required him to slow down. Diane had met Warren on a project 9 years earlier before the divorce, and had recognized him immediately as the kind of craftsman who appeared rarely in any trade, the kind who understood not just how to do the work, but why it was done the way it was done, who could look at a building from 1890 and tell you not just what was wrong with it, but what its builders had been thinking when they made the choices they made. Warren's wife had died the previous spring. Diane had sent flowers and a card. She had been meaning to call ever since. She called now. Warren sounded surprised to hear from her, then pleased, then interested when she described what she had in mind: restoration work on a historical property that had come available on the north edge of Callaway County, a farmhouse from the 1880s that had been in the same family for 4 generations until the last member of the family had died without heirs the previous year. The estate was being handled by a probate lawyer who had listed the property for sale and had received several offers from developers who wanted to tear it down and build something new. Diane wanted to restore it. She had no financial justification for this. She had not run the numbers on whether restoration was viable against new construction. She had not consulted her accountant or her lawyer or anyone whose opinion she usually consulted before making decisions. She was making this call on the basis of something that had been growing in her since the previous afternoon, a conviction that she had been building the wrong things for the wrong reasons, and that she needed to start understanding more clearly what she was actually for. Warren Stiles listened to her describe the farmhouse and said, "When can we go look at it?" Let me tell you about the weeks that followed, because they are the part of this story that is hardest to describe without making it sound more orderly than it was. Real change, does not arrive the way a project completes. It does not have a deadline or a punch list or a clear moment when the work is done. It happens the way roots grow below the surface and over time in directions that are not always visible until something pulls them into the light. Diane sold the Cadillac on a Tuesday in August. She did not make a ceremony of it. She called the dealership where she had bought it, arranged the trade, and drove away in a Ford F250 crew cab with a tool bed and a rear window that needed replacing. The truck was 3 years old and had been used hard by its previous owner, a contractor from Monteau County who had maintained it well, but not gently. It smelled like coffee and work gloves and the particular mineral smell of construction dust that never fully leaves a vehicle once it has been there long enough. She did not put Mercer Construction on the doors. Boyd noticed the truck the first morning she drove it to the site. He looked at it for a moment without expression, and then he looked at Diane, and then he went back to what he had been doing. But later in the afternoon, during a break, he said to her, "My father drove a truck like that. Same color even." Diane said, "It felt right." Boyd nodded as if this made complete sense, which to him it did. The entrance road was poured that Monday as promised. The concrete cured over the following week, and the paving crew came on a Thursday and laid the asphalt, and by the following Monday the road curved through the stand of mature trees exactly as the original design had specified, creating the impression Diane had envisioned from the beginning. Money, privacy, nature preserved, and present the sense that someone had thought carefully about what arriving here should feel like. The stone for the memorial sign arrived in the second week of September. Diane had spent 4 evenings writing and rewriting the inscription sitting at her kitchen table after Petra had gone to bed, drafting versions and crossing them out and starting again. She was not a writer and did not pretend to be, but she understood that what she was writing needed to carry weight, needed to say something true in language plain enough that it would not lose anyone and specific enough that it would mean something to the people who read it. The final version was carved into Missouri granite by a stonemason in Columbia who had been doing this work for 30 years. The main inscription read, "This land was farmed by the Caldwell family from 1847 to 1994. Before these houses were built, there were crops. Before these lawns were planted, there were fields. The people who worked this ground built it with their hands, their backs, and their stubbornness. We honor their memory." Beneath the main inscription, a smaller plaque. This entrance was made possible by Harlan Greer and his father Roy Greer's 1932 Caterpillar 20 crawler tractor, which succeeded where modern equipment failed. Some things do not become obsolete. They just wait. Diane drove out to Harlan's farm the day before the stone was installed. She brought photographs of the inscription so he could read it before it was permanent. Harlan stood on his porch and looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. His farmhouse was a 2-story white frame building that had been repainted recently, the porch boards replaced at some point in the past few years, with boards that matched the originals in width and material if not in age. The farm had the look of a place that had been worked and maintained by the same hands for a very long time, where every improvement was practical and every practical thing was done well. "This is right," he said finally. He handed the photographs back to Diane. "My father would have appreciated the second plaque." Diane nodded. "I wanted him to be part of it." "He is part of it," Harlan said simply. "He's been part of things like this for a long time. He just doesn't get credit for most of them." "That's all right." He didn't do it for the credit. They stood on the porch for a moment in the late afternoon light, the sounds of the farm around them, the specific quiet of a working place at the end of a working day. "I owe you more than a sign," Diane said. Harlan looked at her. "No," he said, "you don't." She looked back at him. "You asked me why I helped you after the way you spoke to me," he said. "I want to give you an answer because I think it's the part that matters." He looked out across his fields, the late crops still standing, the particular golden quality of Missouri light in the last days of summer laying itself across the ground. "My father helped people because he believed that ability created obligation. Not obligation to be thanked or obligation to be compensated, just obligation. If you can do something and someone needs it done, you do it. The quality of their gratitude doesn't enter into it. The fairness of the situation doesn't enter into it. You do it because you can and because someone needs it, and because that is what a person is supposed to do with what they have been given. He looked back at Diane. I helped you because I could, he said. That's the whole of it. The rest was just work. Diane drove back to the construction site in the October afternoon, the stone going in the next morning, the first phase of Deer Creek Estates 8 weeks from its completion deadline. The numbers looking for the first time since the project began, like they were going to be all right. She thought about what Harlan had said about ability and obligation. She thought about her father Carl, who had built things in Missouri for 40 years and had taught her everything he knew without once suggesting that the knowledge was hers to keep for herself. She thought about Boyd Rader's father and the John Deere that was still running on his brother's farm. She thought about Roy Greer, who had spent 3 days failing with ropes and mules and had responded to the failure by sitting down and thinking about it carefully until he understood it well enough to solve it. She thought about what she wanted to pass on. The memorial stone was installed on a Friday morning in October. Diane was there when the stonemason and his crew lowered it into the prepared foundation at the entrance to Deer Creek Estates, the words carved into Missouri granite settling into their permanent position beside the road that curved through the stand of mature trees into the development beyond. She stood at the entrance and read the words she had written. She thought this is more permanent than the houses. The houses will be renovated and remodeled and eventually torn down or rebuilt by people who do not know what stood here before them. But the stone will be here. The words will be here. Someone in 20 years or 40 years will pull into this development and stop and read these words and think for a moment about the Caldwell family and their 150 years on this ground, and think about a man named Roy Greer who sat down after 3 days of failure and thought until he understood what the problem actually required, and they will drive on knowing something they did not know before, that she thought was something worth building. Deer Creek Estates sold out its first phase in 3 weeks. 15 homes at $500,000 each. The buyers were from St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago people who wanted land and quiet, and the particular quality of light that central Missouri has in the long afternoons of summer and fall. People who had worked in cities long enough to want something that felt like it had been here before they arrived. The entrance road made the impression Diane had intended from the beginning, and the memorial stone at the entrance made an impression she had not originally intended, but which she discovered was the thing that several of the buyers mentioned when they described why they had chosen this development over others they had looked at. It felt honest, one woman said, like someone built this place who actually thought about what it meant to be here. Diane called Patricia Ogden and arranged the restructuring of the loan that Patricia had been recommending for 18 months. She called Garrett at the bank and made the payment that was due on time with no drama. She called Boyd Rader and told him that his son-in-law should come in Monday morning to talk about Phase 2. She called Warren Stiles and told him she was moving forward on the Caldwell farmhouse restoration. She did not call Dennis Crowell. In January of 1995, on a morning so cold that the finished homes of Deer Creek Estates were rimmed with frost that caught the early light and held it, Diane drove to the entrance with Petra. Petra was 16 and did not know the full story of what had happened in July. She knew that her mother had faced a difficult problem on the construction site, and that an older farmer from the neighboring property had helped solve it. She knew that the stone at the entrance was connected to this in some way. She did not know the details. They parked and walked to the stone. Petra read it slowly, the way she read everything, not skimming but taking each word in sequence, her breath making small clouds in the January cold. She read the main inscription, and then the smaller plaque beneath it, the one about Harlan and Roy Greer, and the 1932 crawler. When she was done, she stood for a moment looking at the carved words. "Who is Harlan Greer?" she asked. Diane told her. All of it. Not the version she might have told a client or a competitor or someone whose opinion she was managing, but the version that was simply true beginning to end. The 14 days of failure, the $30,000 spent, the old farmer appearing on the access road with his rust-orange crawler and his trailer of chains and pulleys, the laughter, the words she had said in front of her crew, Harlan's face, which had shown neither hurt nor anger, only that settled patience. The morning of watching him work, the notebook, the first root breaking, the 5 seconds of silence after the stump came up. She told Petra about Roy Greer and the 3 days with ropes and mules. She told her what Harlan had said about ability and obligation. She told her about the spare chain on the trailer, the cracked link, the replacement made without announcement or drama as a matter of simple preparation. Petra listened the way she listened when she was genuinely engaged with something, with her full attention directed at the person speaking, not waiting for a pause in order to say what she was thinking, but actually listening, taking it in, letting it settle before responding. When Diane finished, Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So the man you laughed at saved everything." "Yes," Diane said. "And he helped you anyway." "Yes." Petra looked at the stone again. "I want to build things like that," she said. "The stone, no." She turned to look at her mother. "Things that tell the truth about where they came from. Things that don't pretend the land was empty before someone built on it. Things that make people think about what was here before them." She looked back at the inscription. That's what architecture is supposed to do, isn't it? It's supposed to hold memory. Diane looked at her daughter and felt something she could not have described in the moment, but that she would spend the rest of her life understanding more fully, something that had to do with the relationship between what we do and what we pass on, between the lessons we learn and the forms those lessons take when they travel from one generation to the next. She had not planned to teach Petra this particular lesson. She had not planned any of it. She had planned 2 years ago to build a successful development and prove something to an industry that had sometimes doubted her. And along the way she had made a series of decisions that had nearly ended everything she had worked to build. And she had been rescued by an old man with an old machine and a philosophy that had been passed to him by his father, and that he had passed to her without ceremony or condition. And now she was standing in the January cold beside her 16-year-old daughter, who had heard the story and understood it on the first listening in a way that Diane had needed the whole difficult summer to begin to grasp. "I want you to meet him," Diane said. "Harlan Greer." Petra nodded. "I want to see the crawler." They drove out to the Greer farm that afternoon. Harlan was in the equipment barn when they arrived, doing the monthly maintenance on the Caterpillar 20, the oil and the filters and the mechanical checks that kept a machine running when machines of that age had every reason to stop. He looked up when they came in, nodded at Diane, and looked at Petra with the same calm assessment he brought to everything. Petra looked at the crawler for a long moment. It was the first time she had seen it outside of her imagination, and she stood before it with the focused attention of someone trying to understand not just what a thing is, but how it became what it is. Is this the one? She asked. That is the one, Harlan said. My father bought it from a dealer in Colombia when it was 2 years old. Paid $800. He looked at the crawler with the uncomplicated affection of someone who has worked beside a thing for so long that it has become simply part of the landscape of life. He started it every month to keep the engine from sitting, even in the years when there was no work for it. Said a machine that doesn't run will forget how. Petra walked around the crawler slowly, the way Harlan had walked around the stump in July, taking it in from every angle. 83 years old, she said, reading something on the machine. Harlan nodded. Build quality was different then. Not better in every way, but more focused on durability than on features. This machine was designed to do one thing well for a long time. It has done that. Petra stopped at the front of the crawler and looked at it directly. My mother said you told her some things don't become obsolete, they just wait. Something moved across Harlan's face, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. I did say that. I'm going to remember that, Petra said. Harlan looked at her with the pale gray eyes that Diane had come to think of as the most honest eyes she had seen on a human face. Eyes that did not perform and did not conceal and did not adjust their expression based on what the person looking into them might want to see. Good, he said. Then use it. The years that followed were different from the years that came before. Not easier exactly, but truer. Mercer Construction took on projects that did not fit the standard model of what a residential construction company was supposed to pursue. The Caldwell farmhouse restoration, which Warren Stiles oversaw, and which became, over the following year, the kind of project that gets written up in regional architecture publications for the quality of the workmanship and the fidelity to the original structure. A restored Victorian in Fulton, a mid-century farmhouse outside of Columbia that had been in the same family for 4 generations, and that the grandchildren wanted to preserve rather than sell. Diane hired older contractors alongside the younger ones, men in their 60s who remembered construction from before the era of complete hydraulic dependence, who understood leverage and physics and the principles that Harlan had demonstrated. She bought block and tackle systems from farm auctions and equipment estates, kept them in the Mercer Construction equipment shed alongside the modern hydraulic tools, and used them in situations where the modern tools were either inappropriate or too expensive to justify. She taught her crew to ask before they applied force to a problem whether force was what the problem actually required. She taught them the way Harlan had taught her, not through instruction, but through example, and through the kind of patient waiting that allows someone to figure out the lesson themselves. Boyd Rader worked with her until he retired at 62, and his son-in-law became one of the best finished carpenters on her crew, and the family threads of loyalty and craft and working knowledge that ran through Mercer Construction became one of the things that distinguished it from other companies doing similar work. Petra went to architecture school and came back. She had written her application essay about the stump and the crawler and what they had taught her mother and what her mother had taught her, and the essay had gotten her into the program she wanted, and she had learned everything the program had to teach her, and had come home knowing that the most important thing she had learned was not in the curriculum. Harlan Greer continued farming until his knees finally asked him to stop sometime in the early 2000s, when the accumulated years of crouching and kneeling and climbing had made those activities more costly than they had once been. He leased his fields to a neighbor's son who was expanding his operation, and he spent more time in his equipment barn and more time sitting on the porch watching the seasons move across the land that his family had worked for the better part of a century. Diane visited him every few months, usually bringing Petra when Petra was home. They would sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about whatever was in front of them, the way people talk when they have run out of the need to impress each other and can simply be in the same place at the same time thinking out loud. In the spring of 2004, Harlan mentioned that his son Owen had been asking about the crawler, wanting to learn it, wanting to understand what it could do and how it did it. Good, Diane said. I told him it takes time, Harlan said. You can't rush the learning of something like that. You have to spend time with it. Let it teach you what it needs from you before you start thinking about what you need from it. That sounds like something your father said. Harlan looked at her. Probably was, he said. Most of the things worth saying have been said before. The memorial stone at the entrance to Deer Creek Estates was still standing when Harlan Greer died in the winter of 2006. Still standing and still being read because the development was full of families, by then children, who had grown up driving past it on the way to school and who had absorbed the words without necessarily registering them consciously, the way you absorb things that are always present in the landscape of your early years, not knowing you carry them until something later in life causes you to reach for what you were given and find it there. Diane was at the funeral. She sat with the Greer family, with Owen and his wife and their children, in the Methodist church in Fulton, where Harlan had been baptized and confirmed and married and had attended services for most of 8 decades. The church was full. 200 people or more, farmers and contractors and neighbors, and people who had driven 2 hours to be there because Harlan Greer had at some point done something for them or for someone they loved that they had not forgotten. When the pastor invited people to speak, Diane walked to the front of the church. She stood at the pulpit and looked out at the crowded pews and thought about what she wanted to say, which was also what she wanted to remember, which was also what she wanted to pass on. She said, Harlan Greer taught me that wisdom is not the same thing as knowledge. Knowledge is what you accumulate. Wisdom is what you do with it when someone is watching and when no one is watching, and when the person you are helping does not deserve the help and you help them anyway. She paused. I met Harlan on the worst day of my professional life, she said. I had a $400,000 machine that could not do a job that he did with a 62-year-old crawler and 4 hours of patience. And before he did the job, I laughed at him in front of my entire crew. I told him his machine was junk. I told him to leave my construction site. I said it loudly enough that everyone on the site could hear it. She looked out at the congregation. He helped me anyway. He spent 4 hours pulling a stump that I could not move, and when it was done he refused payment and asked only for a sign at the entrance to the development, a sign that would remind people that the land they were living on had a life before they arrived. And then he told me why. He said his father had taught him that the quality of someone's manners does not change the quality of their need. That if you can help and someone needs help, you help. That is the whole rule. She was quiet for a moment. I have been trying to live by that rule since the summer of 1994, she said. Some days I am closer to it than others. But I have never forgotten where it came from, and I have never stopped trying, and I have made sure that my daughter knows it, and knows where it came from, and knows the name of the man who gave it to me when I had not earned the giving. She stepped down from the pulpit and returned to her seat. Owen Greer was sitting beside her. He reached over and put his hand briefly on top of hers, and she understood without words that this was what people do. when they have run out of language and need to communicate something that language was not quite built to carry. After the service, when people had gathered in the basement with coffee and food, and the specific mixture of grief and warmth that assembles in places where people are remembered by people who love them, Owen found her near the edge of the room. "There is something you should know," he said. "The crawler is still running. I start it every month. Keep it maintained." Diane looked at him. "Because someone is going to need it," he said. "Someone is going to have a stump that the modern equipment cannot move, or a problem that the modern approach cannot solve, and when that happens, the crawler will be ready." He said it simply and without drama, the way his father had said things, as a statement of fact rather than a claim about the future. Diane thought about Harlan walking around the stump with his palms flat against the earth, reading what the ground was telling him before he tried to change anything about it. She thought about the spare chain on the trailer. She thought about the word that had come to her when she first watched him walk across the construction site. That word that meant something different from competence and different from confidence. That word that described a person who had stopped needing to prove anything and was therefore entirely free to simply be useful. Settled. That was the word. She had been trying to get there for 11 years, and she was not there yet, but she was closer than she had been, and she understood now that it was not a destination you arrived at, but a direction you kept walking in year after year, with whatever you had been given, and whatever you had learned, and whatever you still needed to learn from the next difficult thing that arrived in your life, asking to be understood before it was solved. The Caterpillar 20 waited in its barn through the winters and summers that followed, started monthly, maintained with care, ready. In the spring of 2015, on a morning when the Bradford pear trees along the Missouri highways were white with bloom, Petra Mercer stood on a construction site outside Fulton and listened to the sound of a hydraulic hose blowing on a machine that was not old enough or wise enough to have known when to stop. She was 37 years old. She had been running Mercer Construction with her mother for 8 years, taking on more of the daily operations. As Diane moved toward the kind of semi-retirement that people in the construction business reach when they have earned it, the kind where you consult more than you direct and trust the people around you more than you instruct them. The stump in front of Petra was a 100-year-old elm, smaller than the oak in the Deer Creek story, but with a root system that had spread through the Missouri clay in the complicated way that old trees develop when they have had a century to do as they pleased. The excavator was newer than the one Diane had used, with better hydraulics and more horsepower, and a digital display that told the operator exactly how much pressure was being applied at every moment, which had not prevented the hydraulic hose from blowing. The crew stood around looking at the problem with the expression that crews develop when they are waiting for direction that the person in charge has not yet figured out how to give. Petra stood with her notebook open, the same kind of leather-bound planner that her mother had carried for 20 years, and looked at the stump and thought about what it required. Then she heard it. Metallic, rhythmic, slow and deliberate and entirely unhurried, coming from the direction of the county road. The Caterpillar 20 came over the rise in the access road, the same way it had come over the rise at Deer Creek Estates in the summer of 1994. Rust orange and unhurried, its steel tracks pressing into the Missouri ground with the weight of 83 years, its engine running with the loose, steady rhythm of something that has been running long enough to have found its permanent pace. Owen Greer was at the controls, in his 50s now, wearing faded denim and work boots, his face carrying the outdoor lines of a man who has spent his life doing useful work in Missouri weather. He had the same settled quality in his movements that his father had had, that his grandfather had had, that quality of a person who has nothing left to demonstrate. He stopped the crawler at the edge of the work area and climbed down. He looked at Petra with recognition, although they had not met since she was a teenager. "You must be Diane's daughter," he said. "You have her eyes." "I think you knew my mother," Petra said. "And your father." "I did." He looked at the stump. "Looks familiar." Petra looked at him. "Can you help?" Owen looked at the stump. He looked at the blown hydraulic hose on the excavator. He looked at the trailer behind the crawler loaded with chains and pulleys and wooden blocks that had been doing this work since before either of them was born. "Probably," he said. "But first, I want you to do something." She waited. "Call your mother," Owen said. "Put her on speaker. I want her to hear this." Petra took out her phone. She dialed her mother's number and switched to speaker as it rang. Diane answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of a parent who has learned over decades that calls from children working can carry news of any kind. "Petra, what is it? I have a man here named Owen Greer," Petra said. "Says you knew his father." A silence came through the phone, brief but substantial. The silence of someone encountering a name from deep in their own history. Owen Diane said, "Is that your father's crawler I hear running?" "It is Mrs. Mercer." "And I believe your daughter has a stump." "She does," Diane said. Her voice had shifted to something warmer and older and more layered than the voice she had answered the phone, with the voice of a woman who has lived long enough for certain moments to rhyme with other moments in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like something the world is trying to tell you. "Pull it out for her, Owen, and make sure she watches. Make sure she understands every part of it." "I will." Petra ended the call and looked at Owen Greer, who was already walking toward the stump with his hands in his pockets and his boots leaving deliberate impressions in the Missouri clay, beginning the examination that had to happen before the work could happen, reading what the ground had to say before attempting to change what the ground was holding. She opened her notebook. She uncapped her pen. She watched. Built in 1932. Designed to pull, still pulling, not because it is stronger than modern machines, not because its technology is superior or its specifications more impressive or its operator seat more comfortable, but because it was built for a different definition of better, not faster, not more powerful, not more impressive from a distance, just stubbornly, precisely, patiently effective at the one thing it was built to do in the hands of people who had learned what it required and had passed that learning on across generations, the way useful things get passed on, not through formal instruction, but through patient demonstration, through the accumulated example of people doing the right work the right way for the right reasons, and trusting that the watching was its own kind of teaching. Some things do not become obsolete. They just wait for the next person who needs to learn that patience is not the absence of action. That understanding what you are dealing with before you try to deal with it is not delay. That the most important preparation you can make for failure is deciding in advance that failure will not be the end of the effort, only the beginning of a better understanding of what the effort actually requires. The Missouri clay held the roots of the elm the way it had held the roots of the oak, the way it had held everything that had ever grown in it or been buried in it or stood on it with the patient permanence of something that has been here longer than the things it holds and will be here longer than the things that come to claim it. Owen Greer knelt in the clay and pressed both palms flat against the earth at the base of the roots. He held them there. He waited. He read.